we're going to be looking at the language in tissue now. So hopefully you've watched the context video and got some clarity on that. It would make more sense if you go to that video first, because we will be expanding on some points that we made in the context video in this language analysis. So beginning with the first three stanzas, we have got paper that lets the light shine through, pause. And this pause is known, of course, as a caesura. This is what could alter things, paper thinned by age or touching, enjambment, of course, and we've discussed these 2 points in the context video, where essentially Dharker initiates and adds a whole load of caesura, so a lot of pauses, a lot of fragmented sentences, and enjambment within this kind of seemingly structured 4 lines per stanza rule that she's put in her poem, which gives this illusion of, I guess, structure and tightness and order, but actually within that order there's this flow, there's this kind of movement of topic. There's no rules. The topic doesn't stick to each sentence, it doesn't stick to each stanza, it kind of goes on to the next. And I think we can see this actually in the way that the title works with the body of the poem, how it flows into the body of the poem in a way. We've got the title tissue, and usually the title is there to be separated from the rest of the poem. It introduces the topic and then the poem begins on a fresh new topic. But there seems to be a kind of dictionary definition style in the way that Dharker has set out her first sentence of her poem. We've got tissue, which is the object, which is the noun, in the form of the title of the poem, and it seems as if there's a kind of definition of this noun, of tissue, within the first line. We've got tissue, paper that lets the light shine through. It almost seems like Dharker is defining what tissue is in the body of her actual poem. This is very unconventional because the title really seems to link to the poem. It seems to belong in the poem, and it really adds to this idea of flow. That not one thing, not even the title, is separated or disjointed from the poem. There's no rules, there's no separation, there's just topic flowing into topic flowing into topic, and there's no specific one thing which stands out from the rest. It's all connected. And this starts off the poem at hand. So we've got tissue, paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Now, the first few things that I noticed about this poem is this idea of opinions being reflected. And by this, I'm going to say, let's look at the language in order to really highlight how opinions are reflected in this first stanza. So, tissue is paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Now, first of all, we've got this pronoun, which is this. Now, what I found really interesting about this is how this pronoun this is very cemented, okay? And by this I mean it is referring to a specific object. In this case, it's referring to the paper that lets the light shine through, which is the tissue. So paper that lets the light shine through, pause, this is what could alter things. Now, this refers specifically to the paper. It's connected, it refers and it's referencing the paper. It's not a paper that lets the light shine through. It's this paper that lets the light shine through. We can almost imagine, right? We can almost imagine the speaker of the poem pointing to a specific tissue paper, right? It's specific. It's not any type of tissue. It's this idea of reference pointing towards a specific object, right? And this pronoun this is what we call a deictic pronoun. And the word deictic is basically what I mentioned. So it's when it's referring to a specific object. So deictic is this table. The this is deictic. So anytime this is used, remember, you can always define it as a deictic, either pronoun, or it can sometimes be a determiner as well. In this case, this is a determiner too, because it determines what the object is. So there's a specific idea that tissue is definitely what Dharker's speaker is referring to through this deictic language that she uses. This, it's a very important but very, very subtle way that she introduces this idea of reference and solidifies the idea that paper is strong in its sense. It's definitely paper or tissue that she is talking about. It's definitely that. It's not any other thing. And it's deeper still, a specific type of paper that she's talking about. This is in reference to a piece of tissue. It's almost, like I've said this before, but it's almost as if Dharker, speaker, is holding up a specific piece of tissue paper and pointing to it and saying, this is what could alter things. It's not anything, it's this. The reference, the specificness of it really gives the idea of Dharker's speaker really highlighting the importance of tissue. It's this. Now, what is this? This is what could alter things. So essentially, tissue is this object. Paper which lets the light shine through. Tissue is what could alter things. Now, in the next breath, and this is why I talked about opinions. So in the next sentence, we've got this is what could alter things. Now, one thing that strikes me about this sentence is could. So we've got this really specific reference to tissue. We've got this really specific pointing out, picking it apart and really highlighting the importance of it. This is what could alter things. But in the next breath, we've got this verb could. We've talked about how could really, this really highlights the importance. It really is a strong didactic reference to the tissue, the object at hand. But then in the next sentence, we've got this is what could alter things. And now could is what's known as an epistemic verb, right? Could is an example of a verb which is not set in stone. So the verb could alter things, but it also might not. Verbs such as could, might, may, these are verbs which are epistemic, and they are the opposite to another set of verbs which are known as deontic, which are verbs which are set in stone, such as must and shall, will. So could is not a deontic modal verb. It's not a command or something that has to happen. It's not set in stone. It's epistemic, which is essentially a verb which is not set in stone. It may happen, it may not happen. It could alter things, but it might not alter things. It has potential, right? But it's not definite. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at here, is how this modal verb, this epistemic modal verb, showcases how tissue has potential, but it also might not have that potential to alter things, to change things. Now this is very interesting because just above we've got this really specific deictic reference. It's definite, it's a determiner, it's specific. And then in the next breath we've got this epistemic verb which is not so specific, which is kind of could alter things, might not, we'll see what happens, it's not set in stone. Now, I think this is really interesting because, and I mentioned opinions for a reason, I think Dharker, through her use of contrasting language, and it definitely contrasts when we look at the meanings behind the words, when we look at the definitions of the words and what they imply, this specificness counteracting this non-specificness, it definitely suggests or maybe highlights humanity as something which is formed up of people with contrasting opinions. We've got this idea of tissue being definite, this is tissue, and then in the next breath we've got this kind of ambiguousness, this kind of potential that tissue has, but it might not have that potential. It depends really on who you are and what you believe. I think this definitely reflects Dharker trying to show different beliefs. Now, I purposefully didn't start off by talking about the main language device in the poem because I wanted to get straight into the nitty-gritty idea of having a noun and then having the definition come straight after, which really reflects the flow of the poem. But it can't go without saying that tissue is definitely an extended metaphor throughout the poem, and it definitely reflects many different things. So this metaphor could represent, first and foremost, humanity, how fragile we are just like tissue, how vulnerable we are. I guess that's also an example of fragility, but these two words could mean different things in different ways. Fragile means easily breakable, and vulnerable means easy to let through or kind of very sensitive in a way. But I think this extended metaphor, yes, it's important in showing how tissue represents certain ideas about humanity, but tissue is also an example. Now, it's also an example of different types of paper which have been thinned by age or touching. An example of tissue, of a thin type of paper, is the Quran. So tissue is an extended metaphor for human fragility, of human vulnerability, yes, but it's also a type of paper. It's a thin paper, and in many different forms. One of these forms is the Quran, which is thinned by age or touching. It's old, it's ancient text. And this Quran represents things about humanity, which showcases humanity's sense of I guess, desire for legacy and desire for carrying on traditions. So, first of all, I want to just look at the language here. Paper thinned by age or touching. Now, this is interesting because in the first line here, we've got paper that lets the light shine through. And this verb, lets, really makes us think that paper is vulnerable. It's translucent. It's vulnerable in the way that it allows light to shine through. This verb lets gives us the sense of allowing light to shine through, as if paper is personified. It's passive. It's almost aware that light is shining through it. It's allowing that light to shine through it. It's giving light permission in a way. And this verb lets really illustrates that. Now, in the next sense, we've got paper thinned by age or touching. Now, this is further kind of, I guess, it further enhances how passive paper is, how it allows itself to become thinned, but it also has been thinned by age or touching. It's humanity which has thinned this paper. Human beings who have touched paper, who have preserved it, let it age, have allowed it to thin as well. So in a sense, paper has allowed itself to become thin, but humanity has also thinned it at the same time. So we've got this passiveness to paper, but we've also got this way that paper is used by humanity in order to pass on a legacy. And in that process of passing on paper, it has become thin. So paper thinned by age or touching, the kind you find in well-used books. So we've got this example of paper and this fragmentation of the sentences. It goes on to the next stanza. So we've got this example of a well-used book, the back of the Quran, right? So this reference to the Quran is first of all a religious one. So our first reference to a type of thin paper is the Quran. We think of Islam immediately. The association of the word Quran should immediately make you think of Islam. Now, we've talked a lot about definite and indefinite articles before, so I'm going to refer you to the Quran. The, which is a definite article. And by this, if you don't know what a definite article is, it's a specific type. It's a specific reference to something. So it's the Quran. It's not a Quran, it's the Quran. So just like this is what could alter things, where this is a determiner, it's deictic, the is also a reference to something specific. It's the Quran, it's not a Quran. It's not anonymous, it's not someone's random text, it's the Quran, it's universal, well known. Just as the Bible is well known, it's not a Bible, it's not an object, it's almost a universal representation of Islam. And in a sense, I think the Quran, this reference to the Quran, gives us an idea of the universal nature of religion. Now, in this case, Dharker is talking specifically about the Quran. But what's really interesting is how this specific religion is made not so specific by the language used. So the Quran is an example of a well-used book. And immediately, even though she's singling out the Quran specifically, we think of well-used books as quite universal. We think of well-used books as everywhere. We find well-used books everywhere. So even though she's picking out the Quran specifically, she's really singling out a specific religion. And in this case, it's actually Dharker's religion. She is Muslim. Even though she's doing that, through language, the Quran, well-used books, it kind of expands this idea of the Quran into something more universal. And the Quran could very easily be the Bible. It could very easily be the Torah. So this idea of making something universal, something specific, such as the Quran, which is specific to Islam, expanding that specificness into something universal. The Quran, which is, we know it, is a very specific religion or religious text. It becomes a well-used book. It's an example of a well-used book, and that's less specific. Everyone knows what a well-used book is. It takes something that's small, something that's a specific part of a specific religion, into something universal, into something which everyone can relate to. So the Western reader like me or you, can relate to this, whether we're Muslim or not. Anyone can relate to this idea of the Quran being an example. It's used to represent something a lot bigger. It's used to represent any well-used book. As a consequence, it represents any religious text where a hand has written in the names and histories who was born to whom. Now, this a hand, we've got this anonymous hand, and this is shown through a, which is indefinite article. So we don't know whose hand it is. It doesn't matter. It's just a hand. It's just someone. It could well be my hand. It could be your hand. It doesn't matter. It's a human being's hand. Has written in the names and histories who was born to whom. Notice the present tense verb has. It's not had, it's has. And this gives it a sense of immediacy, as if we can see the hand writing the names and histories of who was born to whom right in front of us, as if it's happening in front of us, as if it's always been happening. This present tense verb is really important because it suggests that it's happening right now. Has written in the names and histories of who was born to whom. So hand has written it, that writing is here now, it's present. And the present is brought to us now, sorry. A hand has written in the names and histories of who was born to whom. So we've got this clash between has, which is present, and was, which is past, the past tense verb. This clash between now, we are here, looking at, in a sense, the names and histories of who was born to whom. This connection between past and present being brought together through this one book, the Quran. Again, note these pronouns who and whom, which suggest anonymity. And we've got this real, I guess, semantic field. Remember that word semantic field, a bunch of words which all link to the same theme. I think we've definitely got the semantic field of anonymity. We've got who, whom, a hand, the names and histories. All these words suggest that there are many, but we don't specifically know who. We don't know who was born to whom. We don't know that. It's just that someone was born to someone else. We don't know the names and histories. We just know that there are names and histories. We don't even know whose hand has written the names and histories. It's just a hand. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. This anonymity, it reflects humanity, that it doesn't matter who. It's not important who. What is important is that it's a human being. It's that it could very well be me or you. It could very well be anyone. So I was talking before about the idea of taking something specific like the Quran and expanding it to become universal until the Quran could very much represent any religion or any well-used book or anything which carries on a legacy of names and histories. Again, this anonymous language, the semantic or lexical field of anyone or anyone doing anything or passing on anything. It could very well be anyone. This definitely, I think, matches. I think it reflects this idea of anyone, any human being, having the capacity to carry down a legacy or having the capacity to use a book in order to pass on a family name or a tradition. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that anyone could carry on a tradition. It doesn't have to be someone who reads the Quran. It doesn't have to be anyone specifically. And then we've got the third stanza, which of course carries on in enjambment. And then we've got the third stanza, which of course carries on in enjambment. So who was born to whom? Remember, we have anonymous language. The height and weight. Who died, where and how, on which sepia date. So again, this anonymity in pronoun such as who, whom. This anonymity really encompasses humanity. So who died, where and how, on which sepia date, pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. Now, this third stanza has an awful lot of ands. An and is a coordinating conjunction. So the repetition of and here really elongates the sentence. You know, we've got height and weight, who died, where and how, smoothed and stroked and turned. We've got this elongation of the sentence. It's not smooth, stroked, turned. It doesn't shorten it. It really stretches it out. So visually, we've got this idea of legacy being carried on. We've got this lengthening of the sentence, which could very well be the lengthening of humanity as we reproduce and pass on writings and, you know, expand families. This idea of lengthening and passing on is really shown through the use of and. This is purposeful. It really stretches out a sentence. It really makes it, you know, it fills it with words. This reference to sepia date, the adjective sepia, is also an important one. Sepia is that brownish reddish colour that is really reminiscent of 20th century paper. It's historical. It reminds us of history because it's kind of aged paper. And then we've got the last two lines of the stanza. Pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent. So first of all, we've got this sibilance, smoothed and stroked. This idea of this S sound kind of makes us think of shushing or hushing or something maybe comforting. Now, usually sibilance is used to highlight something quite ugly or hissing, or something quite menacing. But in this case, I definitely think sepia, smoothed, stroked, even S in pages. This S sound really shines through, makes it seem quite fluid, makes it seem quite comforting, makes us think of legacy being passed down, makes us think of something natural. And then we've got the assonance of turned transparent, this T sound. Again, it really seems quite fluid and natural in our mouth. When we're reading out words which have the same kind of sounds, we're kind of lulled or comforted like a lullaby. So we've got the sibilance, in which case we kind of have this kind of comforting S sound. It's very natural and fluid, and then it turns to this T sound, which is again very natural and sounds very nice in our mouths when we read it out loud. Sibilance and assonance are, as I've just said, words which have the same kind of sounds. Could link to the idea of passing on a legacy. There's things which sound the same and things which come very natural to us. Sepia, pages, smoothed, stroked. There's this kind of comfort. There's not much change in the way that these words sound. The same with turned transparent. There's a lot of comfort in similar sounding words. There's this idea of things being very natural. I've said that word loads, but naturalness or passing on similar words. Same way that we pass on similar legacies. We have children who are like us, who pass on who we are, pass on our traits. So this idea of passing on links to this concept of who was born to whom. You know, we've got this connection. We're all tied to each other. Just as these words are tied to each other through how they sound, we are tied to each other. And this paper, the sepia dates, these papers, these tissue-like papers are turned transparent with attention. So again, this reference to the thinness of paper, this reference to paper which lets light shine through. Paper has been turned transparent. We've got this turned transparent. It has turned transparent. It's not already transparent. So first of all, we've got this idea that humans have actually thinned paper, have actually turned it transparent, and have actually thinned it over time, which links to this sentence, this idea that paper has become thinned. It's not naturally thin, which I think really goes against the first line, which suggests that paper is personified into something which allows light to shine through. Well, actually, no, paper has become something that lets light shine through because of attention, because of human beings touching it. Now, this is the literal meaning of transparent, something which lets light shine through, which light naturally shines through. But we've also got a different meaning to transparent. Now, transparent could also be a metaphor. It could be a metaphor. So if we think about this idea of transparency, transparent means something which allows light to shine through. It's thin, it's been aged, it shows something. Now, this transparency could also be a metaphor. So I want to talk just a little bit about the two meanings of transparent and how paper can, this really cements this extended metaphor throughout the whole poem. So transparent. So one, we've got the literal meaning of transparent, which is paper or tissue or anything like glass is transparent. It lets light shine through. So something, an object which is transparent is see-through. Now, the metaphorical meaning of transparent, which I think matches very well with the extended metaphor throughout the whole poem, this idea that tissue represents humanity, could be that this paper, which is transparent with attention, with its pages smoothed and stroked and turned, could represent humanity as transparent. Because tissue represents human fragility, it represents how vulnerable human beings are. We are all transparent, just like tissue. Now, we are all see-through. Everything we do is in order to pass on a legacy. Our desire to pass on a legacy, in a sense, to live forever, through passing on books, passing on family trees, passing on birth charts, passing on who was born to whom, passing on the Quran or Bible. This is a transparent thing we do. right? It's obvious. We do it because we are so easy to see through in a way. We are essentially wanting to be powerful. Now, if you have watched the context video, you'll see that one of the main themes of the poem is human power and how we pass on books and kind of religious texts and birth charts and so on. We pass on these forms of paper in order to have our legacy, in order to remain powerful, in order for humanity to live forever, right? And in a sense, this passing on of paper, this kind of, in a sense, this passing on of paper is a transparent way of attempting to live forever. It is a transparent way of keeping our legacy. I've repeated myself so much. So if we look at the line transparent with attention, first of all, this transparency could be relating to paper itself, how it's become transparent because people have touched it. But it could also relate to how transparent human beings are in their need to live forever. We, as human beings, are see-through. We're not that deep. We're not that complex. Everything we do all relates to legacy, wanting to live forever, wanting to keep the power that we have. So looking at the next 3 stanzas of the poem, we've got, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. See how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. So first of all, we've got this kind of conditional if, which makes it a bit of a hypothetical. Now, a hypothetical is basically when someone is asking a question that probably won't happen, but it's a conversational tactic. It's as if the speaker of the poem is trying to be informal, having a conversation. She's essentially suggesting something, isn't she? She's saying if buildings were paper. Buildings aren't actually paper, but she's suggesting it. Again, we have this use of might, which is very similar to the first stanza, is what could alter things. Again, might is an epistemic verb. So it's not set in stone, it's not concrete, it's epistemic, which means it may or may not be. But again, this epistemic verb really gives this idea that the speaker is giving her opinion. It's not a universal thing, it's simply the speaker's opinion. And this is really solidified by the personal pronoun I. And this is the first time we hear about a personal pronoun or an I, where the 4th stanza in the poem, and that's when we realise that actually this poem is from someone's point of view. It's this I, this persona, the speaker, whoever that might be. It's someone's, like I said, opinion. And so I guess that explains this epistemic modality, this kind of, it's not concrete, everything is kind of one speaker's opinion. We've talked about the way that opinions reflect humanity. In showing and reflecting one speaker's opinion, we kind of reflect the way that humanity is split off into different opinions and different sects and different castes. So yeah, we've got, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. See how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift. So immediately here, hopefully we've noticed that there's a personification. The buildings are personified. They're falling away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. So we've got natural language. We've also got a lot of natural language here. We've got the sun. We've got references to rivers, mountain folds. There's this idea of having kind of this motif of nature. And now motif is basically, it's kind of similar to a semantic field. So you could call it a motif or a semantic field, but it's good to use both words. If you can try and get both words in your essay or in your analysis, it will really kind of amp you up to getting more points. But motif, yeah, it's basically when there's a load of words which all link to the same theme. In this case, the motif is of nature. So sun, rivers, mountain folds, wind. We've got a lot of references to natural language and natural things. How interesting is that we've got this idea of buildings, which is man-made. Buildings are made by humans. They're man-made structures. And then we've got this idea of nature coming in and kind of taking over this man-made building. It's not just taking over it, but actually destroying it. It says, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. See how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift. They're falling. The buildings that are made by man are falling away. They don't last. They don't last. They're destroyed by nature, the wind. And look at how buildings kind of turn into nature in a way. They're not just destroyed by nature, but they almost become a part of nature. Look at the language use. We've got, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. It's almost as if the buildings are drifting just like wind does, you know? We've got this kind of conversion from buildings drifting, and the buildings fall away in the direction of the wind. So it's almost as if the buildings are falling into the wind and almost becoming the wind. Now, if you've watched the context video, you could very well link this point to this idea, humanity becoming nature. Now, bear with me here, but basically at the end of the poem, we've got that last line, haven't we? We've got turned into your skin, right? So we discussed this a bit in the video, the context video, that maybe Dharker is making a point, maybe one of the points that Dharker is making is that humanity can never be more powerful than nature, because humanity, or human beings in fact, eventually end up becoming a part of nature. And we could say that the last line is maybe a Dharker's way of showing human beings dying and turning into nature by decomposing into the soil. We're all buried and we all decompose. Now, when we look at the way that buildings are shown here, first of all, if buildings were paper, we've got this comparison of buildings to paper. Now, what else is compared to paper? Humanity, human beings. Throughout the whole poem, we've got this extended metaphor that human beings are fragile, like paper, like tissue. So we immediately make this connection that perhaps buildings being paper links to this idea of human beings being paper as well. Also think about it, buildings are constructed by human beings. They are made by men and women. They are constructed and formed as a way of sheltering, preserving humanity. So there's this comparison or this immediate link that buildings are like human beings, or they're a representation of human beings, right? So if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh. A shift could reflect this idea of humanity falling away on a sigh, a shift. We've got this personification already where buildings have become human-like through the fact that they fall away on a sigh. It's almost as if the building is sighing and it's falling away in the direction of the wind, which we just talked about, this idea of buildings becoming a part of nature. Humanity becomes a part of nature. So this definitely links with the idea or theme that humanity or human beings are less powerful than nature. But I think we can go deeper than that. We can actually use this stanza to back up a point, to back up one of the points that Dharker perhaps is trying to make, that human beings and everything that human beings construct eventually end up becoming part of nature. Nature doesn't just destroy humanity, it actually almost accepts humanity. Humanity and human beings and everything that human beings create become a part of nature. So yeah, we've got this enjambment, we've got this carrying on. So you've got this adverb to, which really mimics an informal tone, right? It's as if the speaker has suddenly had a spontaneous thought. Oh, maps too. It's mimicking spoken word. It's mimicking spontaneous thought. It's almost as if the speaker has had a sudden idea, maps too, and that's really shown through this adverb. And also the caesura, as if the speaker is pausing. So yes, we've mentioned that there's a lot of enjambment, a lot of fragmentation, a lot of caesura, but now we've got this speaker, this personal pronoun I. So I think it makes sense to have a lot more caesuras. It really gives this idea of the speaker having random thoughts and layering her thoughts on top of each other, as if she's just thinking of them, as if it's very spontaneous and natural, right? She's making these links and connections to each other. She's got one idea, she's got if buildings were paper, and then from then she gets other ideas, maps too, the sun shines, and fine slips from grocery shops. She's got this association, right? And it's very much mimicking the way human beings think, and the way that we have one idea, right? And we associate things from that one idea until that one idea grows into many different ideas. It's a very clever way, I think, of representing human thought, right, and human behaviour. That is meant to say human thought. So I'm going to start again for the second stanza. So the sun shines through their borderlines. So we've talked a lot about how the adverb to makes the tone very informal. We've got the caesura, this pause, and then we've got the sun shines through their borderlines. So the sun, which is natural, and we pointed out the natural imagery, is shining through maps. we've got this idea of someone holding a map up to the sun and the sun kind of piercing through the map, rendering everything that's on the map, the borderlines that the map shows, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, everything that a map has on it, kind of rendering it broken apart, right? So imagine, you're holding a map against the sun and all the markings on the map kind of become transparent, they become they almost disappear, they almost break apart, and all you can see is this light, this sun shining through. So again, it really very much links to the idea of transparency. That's one thing. Paper is what maps are made of, and paper is transparent. And Dharker wants to remind us throughout the whole poem that there's this transparency, right? That there's everything that paper represents. So buildings, human beings, humanity, everything that is constructed from paper is essentially transparent. It's something that can be broken apart. It's something that can be shone through, right? And it can be easily dismantled by nature and everything natural. So yes, the power of nature is a huge, I think, idea in the poem. But I think that this power of nature it goes a lot deeper than natural things simply breaking apart man-made things. I think it's deeper than that. I think there's this idea that the natural and the man-made can go hand in hand, right? So we've got this idea, we've talked about how buildings shift in the direction of the wind, right? They don't go against the wind. There's no kind of separation, right? And we've talked about the last line, I've mentioned it a million times, turned into your skin. There's this idea of what is man-made, or what it links to human beings becoming a part of nature. Eventually we all die and we all become a part of nature. Maps, right? The sun is shining through these maps. It's piercing through maps in a way that map is kind of melding into the sun. Again, imagine you're holding the map up. All you can really see is the sun. There's this link, this direct connection between maps and sun, just as there's this direct connection between buildings and the wind. Yes, nature is kind of piercing through, it's destroying these things, these man-made things, but it's also kind of Dharker brings the two together. She brings these man-made objects, she brings paper, she brings humanity, and she brings it into nature. She kind of says that nature eventually will consume us all, right? So the sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. Again, all this kind of, I've written it here actually, natural language. It's listed, so it's in list form. And we get this sense that we are looking at a map and everything that it represents. So what do all these things represent? Borderlines, marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. Things are bigger than just the map. So the map is what, is inscribed upon, but actually this small map represents travel. It represents nature. It represents rivers, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. It represents the world in a sense. Notice how we've got no reference to a specific place. It's just maps to their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, but no specific river is mentioned. So it's actually the opposite of diaxes. There's nothing mentioned. Remember we talked about how diactic words references a specific thing. In this case, there is no specific map that is being referenced to. Dharker doesn't say this map to, she just says maps to, right? So in a way, no specific place is being referred to. These borderlines, these rivers, these roads, rail tracks, mountain folds could very well represent any place on this earth. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what the map is, what the map is showing. What matters is that maps represent all these things and essentially combine all the different elements of travel, nature, and the world within it. And lastly, find slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. So again, opinion, epistemic, might, an opinion. So again, yeah, the speaker is just thinking. She's just having her thoughts put on the page. She's spontaneous. She's layering ideas one upon the other, as if she's writing a mind map, or as if she's just having random thoughts that she's spewing out. Find slips from grocery shops. So these find slips from grocery shops are obviously receipts, and receipts obviously represent the economy. And quickly, just I want to note, in case I haven't been clear, that just bear in mind that each piece of paper or each representation of paper that is mentioned represents a facet or a part of humanity. So we've got buildings, which represent shelter, right? We all need to be sheltered, we all need to be protected, we need to buildings almost hide us from nature or protect us from nature. We live in homes to stay safe, because living outside and living amongst nature isn't exactly safe. We could die of cold, we could die of heat. Buildings help us, shield us away from all that, right? Which is interesting, because Dharker says that nature eventually will end up taking these buildings, and we eventually will be outside in nature. When we die, we become a part of nature. So that's interesting as well, a very interesting point here about how long are we going to be sheltered from nature, and how important is it to be sheltered from nature. And maps here representing travel, representing crossing of borders. So I'm going to write that down. Maps essentially represent, I guess, in a way, expanding ourselves, and through travel we kind of experience different people, different kind of different cultures as well, and different cities, different worlds, right? We step out of our comfort zone, and we use maps in order to step out into the world. So the buildings, which help us go in, right, away from the world, and then we've got this maps which help us go out and help us kind of get away from these, from our houses, and explore and travel a lot more. And then lastly, we've got here grocery shops, which represents buying and selling, the economy. So this idea that these receipts, these fine slips from grocery shops that we get, represent the economy, and we build ourselves on economy. We build ourselves around money, don't we? So yeah, each piece of paper, this representation of humanity. Remember, buildings are constructed from paper, maps are paper, receipts are paper. They all represent a different part of humanity, a different thing, and they all have their own separate, they each have their own ideas that you could build around it. So fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card. Again, this idea of the economy, of buying and selling, something that we really surround ourselves with and really encompass ourselves with. Think about how money crazy everyone is all the time. She says, might fly our lives like paper kites. And again, paper. Right, so here we go. We've got a simile, like paper kites. Dharker is saying that essentially these buildings, these maps, even religion, she references the Quran, receipts and credit cards and everything really might fly our lives like paper kites. They essentially control our lives, just as we or a child or anyone might control a paper kite. And there's this kind of element of playfulness that we can link to paper kites. Right? We play around with paper kites, but it's not a serious thing. It's not, it's just a game, or it's just a bit of fun. And I think linking all these things that build and represent things that we value, represent humanity, Dharker is trying to say that it's all playful and it's all a bit of a game, just like paper kites. At the end of the day, everything that we construct, everything that is man-made, isn't meant to last. It will eventually become like nature. Eventually human beings themselves become a part of nature. So there's this kind of unserious element to the poem. Eventually everything that we value will end up being a part of nature. We ourselves will end up being a part of nature, and it's not meant to last. Basically, it's not meant to last. The things that fly our lives are like paper kites, and paper kites themselves are quite flimsy, aren't they? They float up in the air. They're not meant to be held down. And we can link this idea of paper kites and how they float up in the air and how they fly to the buildings being paper and falling away on a sigh. Just as buildings, which are supposedly solid and heavy and they're meant to last forever, they can fall away very easily on a drift in the direction of the wind. In the same way, these kites fly in the direction of the wind, and these kites are never meant to be heavy and solid. They're meant to float. So there's this real contrast between what is meant to be and what is meant to last and what is meant to not last. And at the end of the day, these paper kites are very, very similar to the way that these buildings are portrayed. They are paper, they fall against the wind. They kind of move against the wind. In the same way, these paper kites move against the wind. So I want to talk a little bit about the sibilance in the poem, and I thought that these 3 stanzas is the perfect chance to really look at the way that this S sound is used and why it's used. So previously we had smoothed and stroked, and even throughout the poem, if you pick it out, there's plenty of sibilance. This S sound is really highlighted, and I've underlined the S sound here in these 3 stanzas too. And I want to discuss why, because it's just an interesting and purposeful device that Dharker has used, and there's always a reason for everything. So first and foremost, I definitely think that usually sibilance creates a kind of hissing or uncomfortable feeling. Snakes hiss, and so historically, ever since Shakespeare, the S sound or the deliberate use of sibilance and the S sound in writing has been used to kind of create this hissing or uncomfortable feeling. Now, I definitely think that perhaps you could angle this idea of discomfort or hissing to the poem. You could definitely suggest that there is maybe a negative undertone to this idea of buildings being paper and falling away. And even on the idea of grocery shops and money making the world go round, and this kind of idea perhaps that everything that humanity has constructed is meant to be destroyed, it's meant to fall. This definitely makes sense why Dharker would use a lot more sibilance to create this kind of uncomfortable or hissing effect, because everything that is human is eventually vulnerable. It's eventually meant to be destroyed. The buildings are being destroyed. These maps are essentially being pierced through by the sun. These fine slips from grocery shops, these receipts, everything that is economical, everything that is sold and bought, and everything that represents money is eventually going to fly out like paper kites. It's lightweight. It doesn't matter. Nothing is stable. And I think it definitely creates a sense of reflection or uncomfortableness in the reader, that everything that we value, everything that our society is made up of, is actually unimportant. It makes for a bit of an uncomfortable read. I think it's meant to unsettle us a little bit. You know, especially if you've watched the context video, you'll see how this idea of buildings being paper could maybe reference 9/11, an uncomfortable moment for all of humanity. More than uncomfortable, of course, a tragedy, a historic moment, absolutely awful moment. If you remember, if you were there, you know, it really reset the way that people behaved, and it caused wars and discrimination, and it caused a lot of pain. So these associations with the idea of buildings falling, with this idea of even traveling, even, you know, human beings mingling with each other, or the idea of the economy shaping us. Think about recessions, think about how ugly money can turn human beings, think about the way that travel can really very easily turn very ugly and create a lot of discrimination within us, that human beings, when we are unfortunately made to mingle with each other, we start to alienate each other because we're different, you know, we're different to each other, and so we start to kind of discriminate with each other. Think about the inherent ugliness of humanity. Think about how ugly and horrible human beings can be to each other. I think that definitely could really represent why Dharker has chosen to really use a lot of sibilance. And it's not just in these, like I've said, in these 3 stanzas. She goes on to use quite a lot of sibilance, even in the last line, in the last 2 lines, thinned to transparent, turned into your skin. So at the end, we've got this word skin, which really settles and kind of uncomfortably lodges itself in our brains, skin. So yeah, the sound of the tone of it, the sound, the kind of sibilance and the effect that the sibilance has, I think it initially definitely unsettles us. If you notice, there is a bit of assonance as well. Remember, assonance is when non-vowels have the same sound. So R, rivers, roads, rail tracks, right? So as well as the sibilance, we've got this kind of insertion of assonance of the R sound. So why this change? Why this sudden assonance of rivers, roads, rail tracks? Well, there's this kind of separate flow going on here. The separate flow breaks up the sibilance. So the sibilance that we are used to, this S sound that we are used to now, has been a little bit broken up. We've got rivers, roads, rail tracks. And I think this could, I mean, this might be a bit of a reach, guys, but, well, nothing's a reach in poetry. I think this definitely could link to breaking up tradition or opinions, right? Think about ideas that we've always had, ideas about travel, ideas about buildings providing shelter, ideas about money. Think about long-held traditions that we've had associated with religion, associated with legacy. We've always believed things a certain way, and a sudden breakup of that belief might end up being a little bit uncomfortable for us to read about. It might end up making us question and rethink long-held ideals. So perhaps this breakup of the S sound with the R sound, this breakup of sibilance with sudden assonance, might kind of be Dharker's way of lodging and inserting something different, a different tradition, a different way of thinking into the poem, representing this difference of thought or difference of opinion. Now, I have talked a bit about the way that Dharker talks about discrimination in some of our other poems. So, for example, we've got The Right Word, which is a poem about how we view terrorists and who might these terrorists be underneath being a terrorist. Who are they as a person? We never really think about terrorists as people. We never really think about why they might have chosen the life path that they've chosen. And in the same way, we do that, I think, with everyone. We immediately judge. We don't think about people as human beings anymore. We think about them by labels, such as terrorists, or labels such as we see a shopkeeper and they're just a shopkeeper to us. It's very hard for us, I think, to see people as human beings and to kind of view their opinion and maybe balance their opinion out with our own. We very rarely do human beings view other human beings as equal. I think this insertion of a different sound, we've got this S sound, which we're so used to, it's a hissing sound, it's uncomfortable, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden we've got this R sound, which interjects the S sound, it changes it up, it makes this jarring difference. It's a different sound. And we could very well say that this different sound could very much represent a different opinion. So this idea of difference, of something that we're used to, this S sound being interjected by something that we're not so used to, this R sound, there's this contrast, it's this sudden change in tone, and I think it's not very far-fetched when we're reading a poem about humans and how humanity is constructed and how people view each other and view cultural traditions, to say that this sudden change, could very well be a reflection of the way that we look at each other and the way that human beings think about change and think about breaking up tradition. Having to view something in a different light, or having to view another human being in a different light, different to how we imagine that human being to be, can be very uncomfortable and sudden and scary. And of course, the R sound in the poem, it's not scary, but it certainly breaks up what we know, right? And it breaks up and suddenly separates itself from what we're used to.